So I was here at the car wash a couple of weeks back, and my Jeep was in the air, getting washed, undercarriage, high pressure, you know. And this guy walks up, and he's looking at the Jeep. Says, "Wow, that's really nice. That's a nice Jeep. That's a CJ3B, right?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's a Japanese clone of that, you know." And he had a look underneath, and he said, like, "Nah, this is like a replica. Here in the Philippines, they call it an owner-type Jeep. So it's like a truck chassis or whatever that just has like something that looks like a Jeep tub thrown on the top." I said, "How can you say that, man? It's a Mitsubishi." And he pointed at the front suspension and said, "Yeah, that's no Jeep suspension." So I decided to look into it, and this is what I came up with. So buckle in. This is what we're looking at.
So it turns out that what my new friend there was talking about was the steering gear, not the suspension, but that to a degree he was right. The original Willys MB design uses a steering gearbox that's mounted on the frame in front of the driver's feet. That converts the steering column motion into an arm. The arm moves the drag link pretty much straight backwards and forwards, and that in turn acts upon a bell crank. The bell crank in that case is mounted on the front axle itself, and then the other end of that bell crank turns the front hub carriers or knuckles via short tie rods. The problem with this setup is that when the brakes are applied, the brake friction attempts to spin the axle along with the wheels, and that results in a torque that tries to get the bell crank to tip forwards and drag the drag link along with it away from the steering box, and that in turn turns the steering wheel to the left. And now if you fight that reaction on the steering wheel, then you actually cause the Jeep to swerve violently, and this caused quite a few accidents for GIs who were driving them during World War II.
So link to his video right there.
The upshot of this was that Willys changed the design of the front suspension around 1944 by adding a torque reaction spring as a band-aid to just slow the effects of spring wrap so that the bell crank didn't turn as far forward. Willys, with the CJ2A, moved the mounting for the bell crank up to a tubular cross member between the chassis rails forward of the engine. The tie rod design changed a little bit, with one tie rod being slave to the other instead of them both being mounted to the bell crank as on the MB. That design is better in that it doesn't pull the steering wheel with the brake use, but introduces the new flaw that as the position of the axle changes with regard to the chassis because of suspension movement, meaning going up and down, the toe angle can then change because the tie rods don't stay at the same angle to the axle as the axle moves up and down relative to the chassis. But this design was carried on to the CJ3B and was thus adopted by Mitsubishi in their licensed Jeeps up to the end of J3 and J3R production. I'm not sure when, but at some point the CJ3B's Ross steering box was also dropped for a recirculating ball type. As I mentioned in the introduction video linked above, the J3 is pretty much a straight copy of a CJ3B and was left-hand drive for that reason. However, the new J20, J30 and 40 series were designed for the Japanese domestic market to be right-hand drive. So when Mitsubishi launched the right-hand drive J3R in 1960, the look of the steering is a bit cobbled together, and so does the left-hand drive version of the later J20 and related models, though to a somewhat lesser extent. Sometime around 1960, with the launch of the new longer wheelbase models, it changed to a new steering setup. The steering box stays in the same place, and a similar drag link runs forward, but now the bell crank is bolted to the frame rail, nearly as far forward as on an XJ Cherokee would have its steering box. The drag link then crosses to the other side of the chassis to pick up the knuckle on the opposite side, and then that has the steering damper attached to it, or the steering stabilizer. Then there's a tie rod to transmit steering motion from knuckle to knuckle going across the vehicle. So on a right-hand vehicle, of course, that means that the steering box is on the right frame rail and the drag link passes over to the left side, and vice versa on left-hand drive. I was curious as to where this design came from, because this is the big difference that my friend had seen between this and the CJ3. Because from its introduction, this vehicle is actually quite contemporaneous to the CJ5, but it doesn't look like the steering setup on the CJ5. It predates the XJ by a couple of decades. Well, the answer is that it's pretty much lifted from a Series Land Rover. Yep, they borrowed the drag link and the rod design of the Series 2 Landy, and the advantage of this setup is that with the bell crank as far to one side as it can possibly go, the drag link is then as long as it possibly could be as it crosses the vehicle, and therefore the angle through which it changes as the suspension works is the smallest it possibly could be. So therefore that almost eliminates the tendency to bump steer, and it removes the possibility for towing change completely. Anyway, I thought this was fairly interesting that Mitsubishi had been able to cure some of the issues with the CJ3B steering by very simply placing the bell crank in the spot where the Land Rover steering box would be, and then adopting the Land Rover style tie rods and drag link. Anyway, that's what I've got for you for this week. Bye for now.